Lemberger, and I am a librarian here at the Central Library, and I am honored to be the individual who gets to be the liaison with the League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara with these panel discussions that we have once a month. So today, while I have you a little bit captive here, I'm also going to mention that November we have the Santa Barbara Reads coming up. So this is when we encourage everyone in the community to read a single book. This year it is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, and we have quite a few copies, over 100 available in the library, but we will also have 500 free copies available for community members at our kickoff event, which is November 1st at 6 p.m. here in the library. And that is actually going to be an improv reading of Verily a New Hope, which is the original first Star Wars in Shakespeare style. So we're asking our audience to participate, to come up and read, and as well receive the free copy of Emily's book, Station 11. And then Santa Barbara Reads will have throughout November a variety of events, and the schedule will be posted that we encourage you to participate in, as well as book discussions that we would like as many community members to be involved with. And the events will all culminate on December 5th at the Marjorie Luke Theater with a discussion with the author, and that will be at 7 p.m. on December 5th. So starting November 1st with the kickoff and ending with the author on December 5th. So today, though, we are having a panel discussion that is led by the League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara, and so I would like to invite Lindsay Baker, the co-president of Programs and Advocacy, up to introduce the panel.
I would like to thank the library for co-sponsoring these forums with the League of Women Voters. This facility has a loop with a T-foil for hearing aids. So if you need any help with connecting with that, please speak to Jen. We are having simultaneously Spanish translation. Sylvia Uribe is sitting at the front table, and if you want to hear it in Spanish, you could take a seat at that table with her so you could hear it in Spanish today. Otherwise, there will be a video in Spanish as well as English. TVSB, we are now co-sponsoring our events with TVSB, and I would like to announce that our mayor forums and our district candidate forums are now posted on the League of Women Voters website, and they're just right there on the main page. If you go to lwvsantabarbara.org, you'll see all the candidate forums posted. They are also posted on Channel 17, or you can stream them, and you go to On Demand and you can see the videos, and they also have a place where you can look at the schedule to see when there's viewed. They should be viewed 3 times or played 3 times a week. In the future, all our candidate forums and our community forums as today will be on our website for you to see. The ballots have been mailed out, and everyone should have received their ballots by now. They're mail only, and you need to vote by November 7th. So make sure you vote, and if you haven't registered yet, you can register to vote through October 23rd. Our next forum is going to be on immigration. That will be November 15th. The title is Immigration 2017, What is Happening in Santa Barbara? We will have speakers addressing boots on the ground, legal advice for immigrants, available funding to help immigrants, and law enforcement policies. On October 31st at the League office, we will be having a calendar planning meeting. All league members are invited to come. We need ideas for our forums January through May. If you have an idea and can't come to this meeting, you can email it to our website, lwvsantabarbara.org, so we can get that information. Thank you for being here today, and I'd like to introduce Emily Allen, the moderator. She is co-chair of our Social Policy Committee.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. Today, we'll be discussing revenue collection in an era that does reflect some mistrust in government, and we're hoping that the speakers will address that, less, of course, at the local level. This issue is important to me, and I'm sure it's important to all of you, in part because this funding for our local government goes to our infrastructure, the roads we drive on, the parks that we visit, the libraries that we visit, but also because, especially at the county level, these funds go to health and human services, and especially to those who are the most vulnerable and the most in need. And this is why I'm always very interested, especially at the time of our budget hearings, in seeing how we prioritize and what we fund. So at the local level, I'll just switch here, the League supports measures to provide a flexible and equitable fiscal structure to finance the necessary services for the South Coast cities and the County of Santa Barbara. The League believes that efficient and economical government requires adequate financing and well-defined channels for citizen oversight. We will start by hearing from Santa Barbara Mayor Helene Schneider, who will discuss Measure C. Measure C is the Santa Barbara sales tax for infrastructure repair and essential community services. The League supports Measure C and has shared advocacy information about the measure in the email newsletter, The Channel Voter, that we hope you all receive, and has paid for online and print advertising in support of the measure. Mayor Schneider is serving her second term as Santa Barbara mayor. She was first elected to the Santa Barbara City Council in 2003, and she can come up here. I'm going to switch PowerPoints quickly, and you'll just click here.
Great. Thank you. What a good crowd for a Wednesday lunchtime. Thank you for coming, and thank you for having me here to speak about Measure C, something that the city and the City Council has been talking about for quite some time now. And I also want to take a moment and thank the League of Women Voters for your support of Measure C, which is a very important opportunity for us in the city to have the essential funds necessary to really bring our city up, this older, built-out city that's seen a lot of history, bring it to its next realm and its next generation of maintenance and infrastructure and real exciting stuff, potholes, right? Fixing potholes. That's, I've been told, we know the saying, all politics is local, so this is a perfect opportunity to talk about how you can help your local government and have control and more control over how your local dollars are spent. So I have up here, and I should also mention we're, as you know, in our central library in the Faulkner Gallery. This is a city facility. This is paid for in most part by taxpayer dollars, by your sales tax and by property tax and by a little bit of fees, and also our hotel tax. So the way this measure works, which will be on the ballot right now, if you're a city voter, you should have your ballot so to vote for it. Measure C, I'll just read it: to maintain essential services and repair critical infrastructure, including police, fire, 911, emergency medical response, local streets, potholes, bridges, and storm drains, neighborhood fire stations, public safety infrastructure, parks, youth and senior services, address homelessness, help retain local businesses, support other general services, shall how the city of Santa Barbara enact a 1-cent sales tax, providing approximately $22 million annually unless ended by voters, requiring audits, citizen oversight, public disclosure of spending, and all funds used locally, yes or no. So basically that means that if you buy something that has sales tax associated with it in the city of Santa Barbara, for every dollar you spend, 1 penny of that would go to local services for the city. We would collect that, and under a citizen oversight process, the city council would then set priorities on how to spend that money, and the decisions that we've made has been based on a number of years talking to many of you, to many community groups, and really doing a deep dive analysis of what is needed in our community. Many cities, including the city of Santa Barbara, has a big unfunded maintenance backlog, and we're not new. Cities and counties across the country are like this because of the gas tax that we've seen has gone down, because things are becoming more expensive in terms of the price of maintaining them, and also because other things have happened in state and federal law where funds that we used to rely on, for example, redevelopment agency funds or things like that, are no longer an option for us. So in order for the city to take control of some of its finance and put right back into investing in our city, this is one way by law we are allowed to do that. The wording the way it is the way we are required to sort of phrase ballots like this for a sales tax initiative. So that's why it's phrased and looked the way it is. But that's what's basically on your ballot. And then to go to the next, is that one? Nope. Resume. There we go. So why were we looking at this? If you've been around town, you know, over time you have noticed that the maintenance of our streets and roads are starting to decline more and more. And as I mentioned, the cost of maintaining these roads are getting more and more expensive, and the opportunity to really put in local funding that we have control over has diminished over time. So you've seen this around town, right? We try to maintain the roads that we have by fixing the cracks, because that's one way to do it. And you can see that it's not optimal, because we try to do what we can to make the roads be as new as we can. You've also seen this. This is a slurry seal, right? Anyone remember seeing? You can smell it, right, when it's happening. But this is basically covering over the cracks of a road, and it is one way of maintaining the life of the road for a little while. But over time, those cracks are still there and going to still get, still become bigger and bigger. And if you remember, over the last winter, during that big rainstorm we have, I don't know if you remember that all of a sudden a lot of the roads just started to crumble apart. So in fact, the drought helped us keep our roads maintained, but once we hope it needs to rain again. So what this does, it helps for a few years, but over time, we really need to significantly repair our roads, and not just the arterial roads that most people use, but every road in the city. And so this here we have, the picture is about $16,000 for one city block. To do it right, if you have a road that's really crumbling, it costs about $80,000 per city block. And you can see how that can add up over time. So what does a 1 cent sales tax do? First off, it's city funds. And by state law, it is guaranteed by the state constitution that local funds stay local. It can't be taken away by state government, can't be taken away by the federal government. It has to stay within the city of Santa Barbara. As being a tourist town, and a lot of people who come here and use our services don't all live here. In fact, a lot of people who will be spending money here and paying into the sales tax, about 40% of them, 40% of this funding is going to come from people who don't live here, but who use the services here. So that is, I think, something that is very interesting to know. And then the funding goes to the city, and also this measure requires a Citizens Oversight Committee, which during transparent, open, public hearings every year will have more than one hearing during the budget process and elsewhere, where we'll have reports about exactly how much money has come in, where that money is being spent. When we did our roadshow over the last few years, we heard from the community over and again that they want their infrastructure upgraded, our streets, our sidewalks, making things safer all around town, not just on State Street, but everywhere in the city. And then also there's some older buildings, and the biggest one being our police station. Our police headquarters was built in 1960. It was meant to have about 80 people in it. It now has over 200. And if you may remember, there was an initiative back in 1999 where we tried to get a bond just for the police station. Didn't make it. We knew we needed a new police station back in 1999. Well, it's the same building today, right? And it's not just about making it a nicer building. There's a safety issue here, too. That current police headquarters is not seismically up to code. Should there be a major earthquake here, that building would be majorly damaged. The council realized that so much that it actually took out the 911 call center temporarily from the basement of that building into part of the Granada garage for safety reasons. So that is a big ticket item that we know that this money can be used to pay for. Going back to roads, just to give an example, right now, we're spending about $2 million a year in street money to go to roads, and this is what we can do for $2 million a year over 20 years. This is how much, if we just doubled it. The green is what you're seeing is what would be upgraded over a 20-year period. But you can see, if you go in the backcountry, if you go in a lot of the single-family neighborhoods, all those areas, they're not being touched at all for 20 years. The funding that we could use here, that would cover an additional $12 million a year into the streets. That would cover all of our city roads over time. So you're asked, what's part of the other issue here in terms of keeping it local and having strict accountability? You can come to City Hall any week, any Tuesday when we're meeting. There's a citizen oversight committee that's looking at the process. Every year we'll be looking at this very carefully, and we have control over the city funds that we want to invest in. Was that the last slide? I just want to make sure there. We are very fortunate to have a wide variety of support, and I think that's due to the amount of outreach that we've been doing over the last several years, League of Women Voters being one of them. So I very much appreciate that. But the Chamber of Commerce, for example, realizes if you want to have a strong, vibrant business community here in Santa Barbara, you need to make sure that the bones of the city is working well. Right? Same with the realtors. If you want to have a strong strong real estate market and have your homes be in a safe area, we need to make sure that the basic infrastructure of our full city is taken care of. And you can see here a whole number of organizations here are supporting Measure C. So there's also information here that we have if you'd like to take with you about the services. And I would just say for the 8 years I've been here as mayor and 6 before that on council, we've done our job, I think, in terms of really trying to keep the current city's fiscal health in order. During the recession, we really streamlined a lot of the positions and through attrition made city government smaller. We've been able to work with our bargaining units and making sure that all employees are paying their full share of their own retirement costs. That hadn't happened before. Our funds, our reserve funds are fully funded right now. They weren't about 10 years ago. So I think the city and its operation budget from year to year is in very good shape. But we have our challenges. We have this big unfunded piece that we need to invest in, and if we don't put money into the infrastructure today, it would be much more expensive, exponentially more over time if we just waited. So I'd be open to any questions that you have, but this is, we think, the best way that we can then move forward with an infrastructure process and for essential services, and I hope you can consider supporting Measure C. So thank you very much. Stay here.
We will be taking 2 questions after each speaker, and then after all of the speakers conclude, we'll have time for additional questions. But we have a speaker right there. Go ahead.
So I want to know if we aim to do all the streets over a 20-year period, that's more than half of the projected $22 million per year. Mm-hmm. What about the police station? Because I've heard estimates of that, like, I don't, 50, 60 million
Could
or
be
something?
up to $80 million
$80
for
million.
a new police station.
So
That's right.
when do we get that police station?
So this is how it would work, right? And so, cities only have certain options of how it can fund things in a way. And so what you can do, and you've seen the school board, you've seen school districts do this all the time, is that they will issue bonds. And so let's say it's going to take a few years for us to go through the permitting process. What's the design of the police station? What's the full cost? Get the cost estimates, all that kind of things. So we find out, let's say, it's going to cost $80 million. Well, we don't have $80 million like that, right? We have $22 million a year. We're going to put a bunch into streets. But we can say we're going to issue a 20-year bond or a 30-year bond, and the bond finance folks, right, in order to accept that, they have to know, well, how are you going to pay that debt service? And so that's where this money would come from. It's the port. So if 12 million is being used for streets, we could say we're going to use another 7, 8, 9, whatever it takes, depending on what the bond measure is, to pay the debt service over time each year. So we get the money up front, you build your police station, and then you pay it off like a mortgage, right? You just pay it off. And with the nice thing was a lot of these state bonds is that interest rates are very low. It's cheap money, as they say. So you get the facility up front. What that does is another thing, which I've heard a question about this measure, is that once you do that and you have this bond and you're having the debt service pay each and every year, that locks in that money specifically for that purpose. So it then can't be used for anything else, right? The council is locked in to make sure that that money is being used for that particular purpose. So hopefully Measure C will pass. Assuming it does, the council here this year will plan to think about, giving recommendations about what priorities could be and establishing for next year, the next year's council will establish that Citizens Oversight Committee that can really monitor how everything's going. Thanks for the question. One more, I guess, Cheryl? There's a mic coming.
I'm just wondering if any of this funding will be directed toward downtown redevelopment?
That's a great question. There's a lot of talk about downtown and State Street stuff. Well, certainly as it relates to infrastructure and that is an option. I think you need to, if we remember, when we had the redevelopment agency, we got about $20 million a year in redevelopment agency funds that had to be used for capital purposes back into the redevelopment area, which included downtown. 20% of the money had to go to affordable housing projects, but the other 80% went to capital redevelopment money. Projects. We lost the redevelopment agency 5 years ago. So if you think about it, over 5 years, we've lost $100 million of money that could have been put back into the area. That's part of why we're seeing some of the infrastructure decline over the last 5 years, is we used to have this source of funds we no longer have. This is a local way that we have complete control over how to replenish that piece. And certainly areas around State Street, working with the business community, what does it mean in terms of making sure the infrastructure around their businesses are as strong as possible so that they can thrive, is definitely on the list of things we could do. Okay, those were 2 questions. So thank you very much. I'll be around afterwards if you have any more.
Okay, thank you. So next we have Santa Barbara County Supervisor Doss Williams, who will discuss his efforts at the local and state levels to identify efficiencies and new revenue sources. Supervisor Williams was elected to represent the 1st District of Santa Barbara County in June 2016. Williams previously represented the area along with over half of Santa Barbara County and a quarter of Ventura County in the California State Assembly from 2010 to 2016. Prior to his service in the Assembly, Williams served 7 years on the Santa Barbara City Council from 2003 to 2010. Come on up.
Thank you. First of all, it's just great to be here with so many familiar faces. Great to see a packed house at lunchtime, and people who are very active but want to make sure that they are even more active and informed. It's always inspirational. So first I want to talk about the consequences of not investing. I think that's pretty important. What is the consequences of not investing in public resources and in the future? One consequence is you pay more later. The police station is the great example of that. Back in 1998, that was estimated to cost $28 million to repair. The estimate now could be up to $80 million, right? So the question is, maybe it would have been a good idea to take care of it earlier could have saved us a lot of money. So one consequence of not investing is just simply that things cost more. The other consequence is that you try to elect people to solve problems, and that instead of always being able to solve problems, you elect us instead to figure out which arm to cut off, right? And I'll give the example that Helene just alluded to, redevelopment. We didn't lose $100 million of redevelopment funds. Those are all went to our schools and our special districts. But in an ideal world, would you really want, and they needed it, the schools especially, but in an ideal world, would you want me to preside over or vote for sacrificing badly needed funds we need for downtown redevelopment to save our schools, right? In the ideal world, we would be just, making sure that our schools have the resources by other means. And, but I'll say that the biggest consequence of not investing has simply been the suffering of at least half of the population, if not more, right? I don't know if I'm going to get this quote right, but Hubert Humphrey once famously said that a society will be judged by how it treats children, seniors, and the disabled. Right? And I'd say in the last few decades of our country, we could pretty much say that judgment should be pretty negative because our children have lost ground in terms of investment in education. Our seniors that are in poverty have lost ground in terms of their quality of life. Meanwhile, our programs for the disabled suffer because they're simply were never meant for the number of people actually that need those services. So those are the consequences that I could go over briefly of not investing. I'll say there's one more that's particularly relevant to Prop 13, which is one of the things that folks wanted me to talk about today because there are efforts to reform Prop 13, the Make It Fair initiative, and another group that's involved is Evolve. There have been efforts at the state legislature, including one bill that almost made it through the whole process that I voted for, that tried to eliminate the loophole, right? People that don't transfer ownership have less of an increase in their property tax rolls. And the legislature a number of years ago allowed there to be an additional loophole, which was that you could transfer ownership by just rearranging the percentages of ownership between human beings, right? So you say, well, I'm part of the owner, my wife's another part of the owner, and then you just slowly change ownership without ever reassessing Prop 13 values. And that was a reform that we attempted to address in the legislature. It made it through the Assembly. It died in Assembly or in Senate appropriations. But it's not over. It's still being worked on, and I do think that is a reachable reform. Of course, Make It Fair and Evolve are attempting to do more than that, which is to address the fundamental inequity, particularly in the commercial sector, but also bring it home to what kind of world that creates here in Santa Barbara. Just as a show of hands, how many of you guys are homeowners? Okay, a lot of us. How many of your property taxes are, let's just say, less than $10,000 a year? Okay, that's most of the audience. How much of your property taxes is less than $6,000 a year? Half the audience. How many of your property taxes are less than $4,000 a year? That's still like a third of this audience. And I've been to some of your houses, okay? You guys got some pretty nice places. To give you an idea of what the younger half of this community lives like, I bought one of the cheapest single-family homes in the entire South County 3 or 4 years ago. One of the very cheapest. I pay $14,000 a year in property taxes, right? And so when people, for instance, bash some of the housing that's been created in Santa Barbara and tar it as being luxury housing, they are not taking into account that everybody who's under the age of 50 is paying that much for housing, even when they're living in a shack, right? So if you say that we don't need places that cost $2,000 or $2,500 a month, that's everything we're already paying. I mean, you know, me, it's more like, you know, if I'm including my property tax, $3,800 a month, right? So and it sure doesn't feel like luxury housing to live right next to the 101 construction, right? My backyard literally is the 101. So what I'm saying is that it creates very different realities for people that live in the same community. And I've often said, well, look, the homeowner portion of Prop 13, it may be inequitable, but too many people would be hurt if we changed it. But let's at least change the commercial end, which starves our public services. Really was the beginning of the crisis in education and in higher education, right? And if we want to eliminate poverty, there's only two things that is causational issues in poverty: the cost of housing and education. Those are the things. Everything else is addressing symptoms, right? If we want solutions, those are the two, right? One of the things I was asked to do is to talk about some of the things that we address in revenue. It's difficult, and that's one of the reasons why one would argue that it's a fair thing to make sure that voter thresholds for approval of taxes are 55%, or at least somewhere lower than 2/3. You wonder in a democratic society, should 34% of the population be able to hold 100% of the population hostage, right? And I think that's a fundamental philosophical question. So what is the legislature reduced to in terms of trying to do taxation? Trying to come up with crazy ideas. And you elected me at the time to do crazy ideas. I did. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. I attempted to do a per head tax on strip joints to pay for domestic violence shelters. Strangely, nobody wanted to vote against it, but it died a mysterious death without a vote in a committee. Tried to pay for higher education by trying to use revenue from state parcels that weren't being adequately utilized. That didn't work either. But I did save you from quagga mussels. We're definitely not paying millions of more dollars for water infrastructure because we got a fee on boats statewide to help pay for prevention work in quagga mussel infestation in our freshwater lakes. So my point is that this is all kind of small potatoes, right? is that if you want your elected officials to be able to actually create large change, when they are trying to look for every nickel and dime, I guess you want us to do that, but if they're spending 80% of their time on every nickel and dime, that may be a problem, right? Because how can you handle big things like questions of what are we going to do in healthcare when the federal match goes away from Medi-Cal, right? Like, that's a big question for this state. We've been enormously successful in getting millions more people on health insurance and Medi-Cal. But what happens when the federal portion of the money goes away? What are we going to do? The biggest act that we did in the legislature to save money was cuts. And the biggest cut is probably something that needed to happen, which is PEPRA. It's the Public Employees Retirement Something Act, PEPRA. And I voted for it in my first year in the legislature. It's enormously important. One of the things that's great to be back in local government is I either can look at problems that were created by the legislature and live with those problems, or solutions that were created by the legislature and say, thank God we did that. Because the county is in the middle of a $20 million structural deficit. That's the bad news. It's going to be very difficult for the next couple of years. And it involves some very hard decisions. But the good news is that because of PEPRA, because every new employee that is hired by either the city or the county pays a larger portion of their pension system, we will have a stable pension system within a little over a decade. And what that means is that budgets will get more and more stable at a local government level after the carnage of the next few years, and whatever carnage is created by the next downturn in the economy. And let me be a little more doom and gloom by just saying that I do not believe that, the average number of years between downturns in the California economy over its history is 7 years. So we're pushing the odds at this point, right? We're benefiting from the odds in our favor. Before I close, I want to bring it back to the local stuff. One of the other things I was asked to talk about is SB 1, which is the gas tax increase and the small fee that's about to go into effect on electric cars. Completely needed. And I hope that you stand diametrically against the efforts to repeal it, because it has been a game changer for us locally. At the county level, we were having to entertain some ideas like, what roads can we grind up and return back to dirt roads because we can't afford to maintain these, right? That is really what, absent SB 1, we'd have to be doing a lot more of. What SB 1 has also done is given us hope to actually complete the 101 project within our lifetimes. You may live to see that happen because of SB 1. And it really, it means that any local money that's passed really can get a very powerful match from the state. And it just magnifies the role of a local tax measure. Last thing I want to say, one more thing in support of the city sales tax. The first step in public safety is infrastructure, right? Can personnel get out to people when there isn't good infrastructure? Can we respond to the most basic needs of a society without good infrastructure? So with that, I'll take any questions you guys have and look forward to the discussion.
DOS. Is this on? Oh, yeah, it is. DOS, I've heard some of my neighbors attack the Measure C and similar local taxes by saying that they are regressive. Am I correct that in California, the only taxes local governments can levy are the regressive taxes such as property tax, sales tax, utility tax, and hotel tax?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say. I think the other thing that's fair to say is that support for Measure C is much higher in the working class neighborhoods that those people might be purporting to want to help, because they live with the problems in our infrastructure. So the working class neighborhoods of Santa Barbara are going to vote for this in large numbers. The question is, what are the other neighborhoods going to do? And maybe the other reason is that the exposure, because sales tax does not affect certain staples that you would say, is for, let's just say, a person with an income of $30,000 a year, the average cost of the sales tax over a year would be $30. So even though it is a regressive tax, it will have relatively low impact on our working class communities. And since you're asking the question, I would also say we will have another good opportunity next year if you're worried about the deficit at the county, and you should be, if you care about funding for the mentally ill, if you care about the number of personnel and experience at the jail, if you care about our libraries, you should care about this budget deficit. And the solution that we're looking at is taxing Joe. Marijuana tax. We are looking on putting on the ballot next June. So I hope you all will vote for that. I know Joe will.
Hi, this is about county revenue sources. I recently met a guy who you probably heard of. His name's Frank Sanitate, and he had some really good ideas on this, but he and I have been bouncing that back and forth for quite a while. And he just concluded, I don't think a county bank is viable. We can't totally use the Bank of North Dakota as a model because we can't work through community banks as they do. There are hardly any of them in Santa Barbara County. What's your take on this?
So your question is on whether we should have a state bank or a county bank. So I am definitely in support of a state bank. I voted for legislation that would have created a state bank. It is, to me, putting all of our eggs in the basket of Goldman Sachs and Wells Fargo, to run our economy, bad idea. And North Dakota isn't exactly the bastion of socialism in the nation. If North Dakota can have a state bank and not be communists, then we can have a state bank and not be communists. Whether starting one at the county, that's a harder question because of economies of scale. I haven't really looked at that, but would consider looking at that and the potential value. I still think that one of the things we might get with another governor is a state bank. So if you run into one of the gubernatorial candidates, and since there's like a bevy of them, your chances of running into one is pretty high. Should pin them down on a state bank. It might seem kind of like a peripheral issue. It's not. it would make a lot of things a lot easier. So you pin down those candidates on it. And we'll also go ahead and someone. Thank you so much.
So the League of Women Voters of California is a major co-sponsor of Make It Fair, which seeks to make the state's tax code fair to all by phasing out loopholes in Prop 13 that allow giant corporations and wealthy commercial property owners to dramatically lower their obligations to California's families. Elizabeth Ralston, yes, past president of the Los Angeles League of Women Voters and an analyst on state and local finance for the California League, will discuss the campaign to reform Prop 13. And I'm going to make one more switch. Okay. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to, excuse me, I'm not so good with mics. I'd like to thank the library for hosting this event today and thank the League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara for organizing it, and particularly Emily Allen, Jean Holmes, and Jane Benefield, whom I worked with in making the arrangements for coming here today. And I was originally told that I was going to speak first, but speaking third is the best because you've all now heard why local governments need more revenue. And that's part of the message of the Make It Fair campaign, which is a coalition of faith-based, community-based, labor, civil rights organizations, League of Women Voters among others, and that is working towards tax reform in California.
It works up there. You're not going to see it there.
Oh, oops,
Yeah.
it's working up there.
Yeah.
Okay. So here we have the logos of the various organizations that are involved. Wait, I'm going backwards. That did show up. No, it is working here. So, why now? Well, as you've heard from our previous two speakers, local governments and schools are struggling to provide essential services. And for the League of Women Voters, we believe that one of the most essential services that the state can provide is a good public education for K through 12. California, fortunately, is no longer dead last in terms of per pupil spending on public education as it was in the middle of the recession. But it's not at the top either. We're a very rich state, and we spend a smaller percentage of our personal income on K through 12 education than the national average. So we should really be able to do better than that. Property taxes are an important local revenue source. In fact, for schools, they really are the only local revenue source. And what we have found is that as a result of Proposition 13, large corporations are really getting an unfair, non-competitive advantage out of Proposition 13. So, looks like a lot of the people in this room are as old as I am or older, and were around when Prop 13 was passed. But let's review a little bit about what Proposition 13 did for us or did against us. First of all, it provided that property would be reassessed only when ownership was transferred. And that's really key to what's gone on with corporations. Prior to passage of Prop 13, property was reassessed on a regular basis, and the tax was imposed on that value, which was supposed to represent fair market value. As it is, if I sell you a piece of property, then you will pay tax based on the purchase price. That assessment, there's a provision for that assessment increasing to account for inflation, but there's a 2% cap on that increase. So since 1978, I think maybe there's been 1 year when the cost of living increased less than 2% basically this is amounted to a 2% increase on the assessed value. The assessment can also increase when there's new construction. If you remodel your house, or a company builds a new building, the value of those structures will be reassessed. And then finally, and this is really important, it imposed a basic 1% property tax rate. This contrasted with an average of about 2.6% prior to Proposition 13. So naturally, you lower the rate, you lower the amount of revenue that's collected. And in fact, in the year after Proposition 13 passed, property tax revenues dropped by 60%. 60%, imagine your household income dropping by 60%. This was fairly disastrous. It was particularly disastrous for schools who did not have the option of raising other taxes. And then Proposition 13 also made provision for allocating the revenue from that 1% tax among local governments. Previously, each local government was able to levy its own property tax based on a maximum rate that had been approved by the voter, so that the school district would levy a property tax, the county would levy a property tax, the city would levy a property tax. Okay, the authors of Prop 13 left it up to the legislature to decide what would be done afterwards. What the legislature did was develop a complicated allocation formula in which that 1% was allocated between the local governments and school districts roughly in the same percentage that they would have gotten the tax previously, the larger tax amount previously. Okay, so what's happened since Prop 13? Well, one of the things that's happened is that families now pay more than twice as much as commercial businesses pay in California property taxes. This little representation of the state is supposed to represent that. Residential properties pay about 72% of the property taxes that are collected in California, and commercial, industrial, and farm properties pay about 28%. Prior to Prop 13, there was a much more even split, approximately 45% coming from commercial property. Okay, and what happened in 1978-79, that's what I said a minute ago. There was a 60% decrease in property tax revenues statewide, and fortunately at that time, the state was relatively in good shape financially, so that they made up some of the lost revenue to the school districts. And the result is that over the years, the state has come to provide a much larger amount of funding for the school. So about half of the money that goes through K through 12 education comes from the state, and the amount that the state pays is about a half of the state general fund. Okay, so how did this uneven split between residential properties and commercial properties happen? Well, as we said before, under Prop 13, properties are only reassessed when they have a new owner. And since large commercial properties rarely change owners, they are rarely reassessed. If you have an established corporation like Disney Corporation, like Chevron, like Intel, they've held the property on which their buildings sit for very, very many years, and therefore their base assessment dates back from 1975. So many businesses are paying artificially low paying taxes on artificially low bases. And this has a lot of negative effects, both loss of revenue and providing non-competitive advantages for certain businesses. So this little sort of cartoon is supposed to illustrate the difference between the typical residential tax on residential property in California and on one kind of commercial property. Homeowners in California pay an average of 40 cents per square foot for the land their property sits on. Disney Corporation pays 5 cents per square foot for the land that their headquarters sit on. That's a different factor of 8 difference. And as you can see, Walt Disney Corporation is in a good position to afford to pay more. In fact, this is a little dated. Last year, their income was about $56 billion a year. Similar example here is Chevron Corporation. Chevron Corporation is one of the biggest corporations in California. They have 2 refineries, multiple oil wells, office buildings throughout the state, and they own all of their gas stations. And they've owned all of this property, almost all of this property, since 1978. So that means they're paying property taxes on that land based on the base year of 1975 with those 2% adjustments for inflation. And the result is that they pay approximately $100 million a year less in property taxes than they would pay if their property was assessed on fair market value. Okay, this next example refers to something that Das was talking about. This illustrates a loophole that allows the property not to be reassessed even when it really does change hands. And it's a specific example. The entrepreneur Michael Dell, he founded Dell Computers. He decided in 2006 to buy the Miramar Sheraton Hotel in Santa Monica, California. Now, this hotel sits on the Palisades overlooking the Pacific. It's a prime piece of real estate. It is extremely valuable. But he was going to buy it. In fact, things were pretty well set up when someone pointed out that there was a way that he could buy this property without changing the assessment, without getting it reassessed. And the way was to divide it between 3 owners, in principle. His wife, Susan Lieberman Dell, himself, and a holding company. So the provision of state law right now is that a property doesn't get reassessed unless 50% of the ownership transfers to a single person at a time. So essentially, they get this complicated ownership structure, they do it in stages, and they're able to keep the same assessment. Now, the County of Los Angeles tried a reassessment. Michael Dell paid his attorneys to appeal, and they won. He spent $200,000 in legal fees, but obviously that was a good investment because he's saving approximately $100 million a year in property taxes. Now, in addition to giving, this is an illustration of how this reassessment scheme can really disadvantage new owners. What you see here is an aerial photograph showing 2 parking lots next to the Staples Center in downtown Los Angeles. As you can see, they're virtually identical property lots. One is assessed at around $11 a square foot, the other one at $214 a square foot. No difference really between them. And of course, the owner of the blue lot can't charge any more for parking than the owner of the green lot. That owner is really at a competitive disadvantage because she is paying 10 times as much in property taxes for essentially the same piece of property. So as a state, we would like to be encouraging new businesses, encouraging entrepreneurship, putting assessing property tax in this way is really a barrier to that happening.
So why is there such a difference in the way those two pieces of property are?
Well, because this one was purchased, the green one was purchased a long time ago. The blue one was purchased later, and therefore it was reassessed when it was purchased at fair market value. I mean, the other one is worth just as much as, green one is worth just as much as the blue one. It's just that it's not assessed at its full value. So now we come to what the Make It Fair Coalition is proposing, which is to get rid of this unfairness by creating a split roll in which commercial and industrial properties would be reassessed at fair market value on a regular basis. And that would make new revenues, billions of dollars a year, available to schools, cities, and counties, to all the local governments, agencies that depend on property taxes. We know that Proposition 13 was intended to protect people. In fact, many people probably never realized that when they voted for it, that they were voting to have its provisions applied to commercial property. So it was intended to protect people, and we're not proposing to change the current Proposition 13 provisions for residential properties. So it will not affect people who own homes, people who rent homes, people who own apartments, or people who rent apartments. Those are residential properties. What we're proposing is that there would be regular reassessment for commercial properties. And this basically would bring California in line with the rest of the nation, because virtually every other place in the nation reassesses properties on a regular basis. And in fact, many places actually tax commercial properties at a higher rate than residential property. This map gives an illustration of what that would mean to various counties in the state. This is an estimate from 2 years ago that it would bring in about $9 billion a year. Current estimates are a little bit higher, perhaps as high as $11 billion a year. But for example, Santa Barbara County would end up with about $109 million more dollars a year in property taxes if this proposal were adopted. So we believe that California is getting ready for change. We know that the voters of California continue to value public education. Proposition 30 passed in 2012. That raised income taxes on the highest income earners. That tax was continued with Prop 55 last year. But more important, in 2016, 355 local revenue measures passed to fund schools. So we see that people are actually willing to step up and support the schools. And we believe that these trends indicate that it may be the time now when people would be willing to support such a change. And I can say that I'm from Los Angeles. In Los Angeles last year, amazingly enough, we had, in November, there were 3 revenue measures on the ballot: a bond measure to fund housing to provide supportive housing for the homeless, a sales tax measure for transportation in Los Angeles County, and a parcel tax to fund parks in Los Angeles County. All of these required 2/3 vote to pass, and they all passed. And this constitutional amendment can pass with only a majority vote. So the Make It Fair campaign is working to build public awareness. One of the things we're doing is trying to get local governments to adopt resolutions supporting the proposal. And so far, over 100 school boards and city councils have voted resolutions in support. Over 1,000 elected officials have gone on record supporting this reform. And in 2015, Senator Holly Mitchell introduced Senate Constitutional Amendment 5, which basically reflects the Make It Fair proposal. And it's possible that that will be reintroduced next year in 2018. So, if you think this is a good idea, this is what we urge you to do. First of all, work on your local legislators to encourage them to support a constitutional amendment. Secondly, work on providing information to your community. Write letters to the editor, encourage groups you belong to learn more, start a petition. Those of you who are league members can volunteer with the Make It Fair League Committee, which is a statewide committee. Those of you who are not members of the League of Voters can join and volunteer. And you can also work to pass local resolutions to reform Prop 13. That's to add to that 117 that was on the last screen. So, as I say, we believe the time has come, and we hope it will be now. Thank you very much. What? Yeah, sure.
Flyer that there was, to help small business, there was supposed to be some kind of a tax decrease because it was for all commercial properties. So could you explain how that
Yes, there are various proposals that have been considered in the bill that was introduced in the legislature in 2015. There was a phase-in for properties that were assessed at less than $3 million. There's also provision to exempt the first $500,000 of personal property, which means basically fixtures or equipment in the building from property taxes. You may not realize it, but businesses pay personal property taxes on the equipment within the building. So that was the proposal then. I think the current proposal that's coming from the coalition is also to provide an exemption for owner-operated businesses that own property.
How would you handle mixed-use properties, commercial and residential?
Now, that's a really good question, but I assume that that would be done proportionally. Okay.
So now we have an opportunity for people to ask the full panel. And let's thank Elizabeth for being here. Yes. So you can direct your question to a specific speaker, or you can ask that all the speakers address your question, and we have mics in the audience.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. My question is to Helene, Mayor Helene. Oh, okay, I can drop the mayor.
But I'm still mayor for now.
Okay, so let me think this through. I had it a minute ago, and now I have a mic, I can't think. Oh, yes. My question is about the Oversight Committee on any of these things we pass. How are they put together so that they have actually any power at all? Because I'm thinking of asking our league members to start volunteering for these oversight committees to have a say in where the money actually goes, since it's going into the general fund and already a decision has been made possibly to build a police station. So I think it jumps the gun, and I wonder how effective is that oversight committee?
Sure. And thanks for that. And I strongly encourage League of Women Voter members to get involved in the Oversight Committee process, either as members or showing up to those meetings. And, you know, because they will all be public meetings as well, that will be, all the information will be on the website and on our city TV station and all that. So the issue is, as you mentioned, well, why is it some things are already listed as priorities, as we've been talking about? That has been for two reasons. One, a full analysis of everything the city needs to have accomplished. Like what are the missing needs? What's the capital program? What are all the things that the city has? And over the last 3 years, actually, we went out to the community. We had maybe over the course of those 3 years over 50 community meetings. We've had several public hearings, and we heard time and again that the top. We also did focus groups in preparation for this and polling. And the top two things that came up time and again of the voters' priorities were fix your streets, roads, sidewalks, and the police station. So we heard loud and clear from the community, not necessarily the 7 of us. I mean, we knew there was a need, but that was underscored by voters. Once, hopefully, Measure C will pass, the council will have to create their process. It'll probably be similar to, but not exactly the same as what we do for boards and commissions right now, where the council will create a process for an applications and to have people come on to this committee. Those meetings will be separate and apart and can be combined with budget hearings. So, the details of that is still to be determined, except to say that it's required that the amount of sunlight, as I like to say, or transparency is paramount in this, and that's required by the measure. But I sincerely hope that there will be representation from the League of Women Voters on this oversight committee. Yep.
I'm going to stand up because I can't see you. So another question about that, and following up to what I asked before. So I've heard in the current election forums and such that, hey, if you don't like Measure C, in a couple years we can vote it out. Well, what if we do that, or people don't like it? What happens if we've, in the meantime, created a bond for the police station?
Great.
How does that work?
Well, anything can, any kind of tax that's local that was created by the voters can bringeth and the voters can taketh away. I mean, that's, part of how it works. The city would be, I think if, let's say we issued a bond and had the debt service to pay, I don't know, $8 million a year to cover that debt, and then the voter says we don't want this tax anymore, the council's going to have to figure out where's that $8 million going to come from, because we have that debt to pay. We have to pay it. So what it would mean is cutting into the other part, the current general fund dollars that we have, which is paying for our police, our fire, our libraries, our parks, our recreation programs, everything else that the city does. So that would certainly, if there were a vote down the line to repeal it, that would be part of the conversation. I think, though, part of the conversation I've also heard in forums is, let's look at 10, 20, 30 increment periods and, have that conversation of what's necessary over time. And again, the voters have that complete authority if they want to change the tax structure to do so. So there's, just like when things are renewed, you have to bring it back. I think that answers the question, so.
And I might just give a response to the first question, which is why do you have an oversight committee if you already have to make some of the decisions ahead of time? The reason is a local government has two options for how to pass a tax: a dedicated tax, which takes 2/3, or a general tax, which takes half. What you find is that if you don't tell people most of what you're thinking of spending the money on, that it's even less likely to pass a general tax at 50% than it is to pass a dedicated tax at 2/3. So, it's just, you really have to let people know, because pitching them saying, we need some money, but we're not going to tell you what it's for, it just doesn't work.
It's coming.
Thank you. So, thank you for saying that this is a general tax, and there's a section in there that says it can be spent for any lawful purpose of the city, and that's why it's on the ballot with people for the members of the city council, because you have to be on the same time under the state constitution. That's not my question. My question is for Supervisor Williams. There are two things which I haven't heard mentioned, which I'd like to know your opinion of. One is, many people think that it doesn't make any sense to have a 2/3 vote for a special tax and a majority vote for a general tax. It makes more sense for it to be the other way around. That if, you really want to trust your council all the way, you should have a higher threshold. But if you identify the specific use, then a majority or a lower threshold makes a certain amount of sense. I'd like to know what you think of that. And the other thing that I've heard people discuss, I asked this at a candidate forum and got utter blank stares, I should say, is the notion of expanding the sales tax base to include a range of services that now people pay income tax, the services they provide, but there's no sales tax on the services. And it seems to me if you're going to have the decline of the brick and mortar economy and a transition to a more of a service economy, that might be something that either the legislature or the voters consider. Like to know what you think of that concept.
So Shane, I'm going to, by the way, always watch out for former county and city employees. They always can get asked dangerous questions. I'm going to start by doing that politician thing and answering the question I want to answer, but I'll actually answer your question. There are those hidden possibilities for revenue that Shane's alluding to about broadening the sales tax. I would say another one that is important to look at is the underground economy. I put a lot of time into trying to tackle underground economy issues, but think about it. In a state budget that's, when I was there, just over $100 billion, there is $8 billion worth of revenue not being captured by people paying stuff under the table. And we think of this as really bad people doing this, and I would probably bet you that 90% of you have contributed to the underground economy. Meaning that if you've hired anybody who you haven't checked is a state licensed contractor, and you haven't checked that their license is current, you probably broke the law and helped contribute to an underground economy that is helping to bankrupt our public services. So you all, and you also expose yourself to a greater likelihood of fraud too when you do stuff like that. So we all can do our part, especially on underground economy issues, by simply, doing basic things like checking that their license is current for anybody you hire to do contracting work, even if it's just fix-it stuff around the house. It's a huge part of the economy and a huge part of a missing revenue base for the state. But back to Shane's question, which is, is it fair that many goods are taxed but services are not? Especially when you think about that our economy is transitioning away from goods and more to services. Tough philosophical question. I don't completely have the answer for it. I will refer you to the guy who has a bill on it, though, which is Senator Bob Hertzberg, has a bill that would broaden the sales tax base. It definitely would address some of the long-term issues with revenue that you indicate. And then going back to your first part of your question was, remind me again, Jim?
The flip-flop of the two-thirds to the...
Well, I just fundamentally believe that a minority controlling a democratic government is an anathema to our form of government. And so I'm against a two-thirds threshold for anything. So yes, I would agree with revising a threshold of a dedicated tax downward, but I would not agree to any higher voter threshold for anything, because it's just, to me, it it is just a never-ending trap of allowing, you know, a minority of a society to hold a majority hostage. Yeah, I mean, I'd support revising one downward. I wouldn't support revising the other one upward. Just the amount that I've seen in the legislature and in government of seeing people when there is a high vote threshold, it's always the excuse to hold people hostage, right? It happened in the legislature every time there's a 2/3 vote. Okay, I'm going to be the guy, it's a 2/3 vote, I'm going to hold out. I'm going to want my special road to get thrown in. I'm going to want my XYZ to get thrown in. You know, it's essentially an excuse for political, social, legislative blackmail, you know, and it's wrong.
If I can just add, you may remember our former state senator Jack O'Connell is a big piece of someone to thank why school bonds are only a 55% majority required to pass a school bond by the voters. That was passed several years ago. And just ask any school district what they need for those kind of things, and having that 55% threshold. It's still not a simple majority, but it's certainly better than a 2/3 vote. There's been talk a lot, and the League of Cities and many, CSAC and others, CSAC is the California State Association of Counties, been talking about, do we want to push another statewide initiative that would at least lower specific things for municipal types of services or tax measures down to 55%. So it's not quite a 50% plus one, but similar to what we do with school bonds. And so I would encourage the League of Women Voters to keep track of that. But I know that there's strong consideration of putting that on the ballot in sometime either 18 or 20.
Yeah, and I can respond to that, which is the League of Women Voters also supports majority vote. And I think if we look at what has happened actually after the 2/3 vote for passing a budget went down to 50%, things have worked a whole lot better.
More questions? Yes, go ahead.
I just want to say one thing about what Das just said about contractors. I've had plenty of licensed contractors ask me for checks made out to their personal name, and I refuse to do it. Keep them honest. Have a business name, too. Write your check there. So my question is for Elizabeth. So the commercial, adding commercial or removing commercial from Prop 13, it would be great to sock it to the commercial businesses and say, hey, we're going to do this all in 1 year, but I assume there's some kind of stepped-in, phased-in process in your... Is there an actual piece of legislation floating around? Or?
There was an actual piece of legislation in 2015, yes, and there was going to be a phase-in. But it was basically a phase-in to allow the assessors time to reassess. So, and there was a provision for smaller businesses to have a longer phase, to have a phase-in period specifically for their property.
Mm-hmm. So was it, what, like 3 to 5 years, sort of?
3 years, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, would anyone on the panel like to, feel free to add any closing remarks that you would like to?
Vote for Measure C.
I just indicate that, you know, obviously most of us already have some pretty strong opinions about funding essential services, and what we really need to do is reach people who don't talk about this. And most people at their barbecues or water coolers really don't talk about commercial tax reassessment. a tax reassessment for
You do.
commercial properties. You know, and so, you know, the first step to good outreach to people is realizing we're not normal people, okay? And that we need to talk and reach out to normal folks. One of the efforts I got started on my way out of working as an organizer for Cause. Cause is a member of a statewide collaborative that essentially did voter outreach phone calls, but not asking them to vote for anything, just trying to educate about the split roll. And we need to do a whole lot more than that, more of that, to really get this out there. Because right now, if you're one of these city councils that's being brave enough to be on the record in support, forever after, everyone who runs against them can attack those candidates as they're for getting rid of Prop 13. You know, remember, that's the tone in the commercial that would be used, right? And so, you know, we have to lead. You elect us to lead. But we have to organize so there's actually people that will support it when it comes to the ballot.
And I guess I'd say that I think it's Benjamin Franklin who said the only things certain in life are death and taxes. And it seems like that's something people don't really want to talk about either. I don't think I have a solution to that, but I think it is important that we keep it in mind. I also had someone say, after I'd made a presentation about Los Angeles pensions, he said, I thought the League was a pretty liberal organization. I said, or progressive organization. I said, well, yeah, we are. We have fairly progressive social policies, but we do believe in paying for them. And that's what taxes are about.
Perfect. So, yes, thank you. So,
Maybe just one other thing.
Sure.
Oliver Wendell Holmes, taxes by civilization. You want to live in civilization? It's kind of part of the deal.
Absolutely. So thank you all again for attending today's forum. Of course, we want to leave you with, that extra push to get involved, and joining the League is certainly one way. You'll receive action alerts at the local, the state, the federal level. I always encourage people to participate in the budget process at all levels of government. At the local level, that's usually in the spring when you start hearing about workshops that you can attend. And also, as we heard, please consider both serving on an oversight committee should the measure pass, and also attending those public meetings so that you can have a say in how those funds are used and to ensure that they're used wisely. Thank you.